So today we will talk about the Rashtriya Uchchatar Shiksha Abhiyan. Recently what government did actually approve the continuation of Rashtriya Uchchatar Shiksha Abhiyan till 2026. What is the main aim of the RUSA, means the Rashtriya Uchchatar Shiksha Abhiyan? If you talk about, then remember that basically the state funding to the higher education institution is the main aim of the Rashtriya Uchchatar Shiksha Abhiyan. So let's talk about. So why in news if you talk about, then remember that the government has approved the continuation of Rashtriya Uchchatar Shiksha Abhiyan. Remember that Rashtriya Uchchatar Shiksha Abhiyan till 31st March 2026. So remember that. If you talk about the RUSA, then remember that it is a centrally sponsored scheme. What do you mean by the centrally sponsored scheme? Means there is a share of funding between the center and the state. Remember that. So total expenditure, if you talk about 12,929.16 crore, and with this is the central share and this is the state share, and that is why this is a central sponsored scheme. Remember that. And launched in October 2013. If you talk about. So remember that. If you talk about the funding flows from the Ministry of Education through the state government and union territories to the state higher education. This is the funding flow from the union government to the state government. So remember that. If you talk about the aim of this Rashtriya Uchchatar Shiksha Abhiyan, then remember that providing the strategic funding to the higher education institution throughout the country. This word is very important, means all over the country, throughout the country, there is no exception. Remember that basically provide the strategic funding to the higher education institution is the main aim of the Rashtriya Uchchatar Shiksha Abhiyan. Remember that. If we talk about in new phase, so obviously this is the till continuation from the 2013. If you talk about now continuation till 2026, so what is the main aim in the new phase of Rashtriya Uchchatar Shiksha Abhiyan? Then remember that new phase actually targets to reach out the unserved and undeserved areas, basically the remote areas, rural areas, and different geographic like the left wing extremism, right wing extremism, etc. So if you talk about the new phases in the Rashtriya Uchchatar Shiksha Abhiyan, then areas will be covered. Basically the left wing extremism areas. Remember that. Basically what are the left wing extremism areas? If you talk about Odisha, Andhra Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, West Bengal, if you talk about Maharashtra and UP, these basically consist of left wing extremism. So remember that. Aspirational district, tier 2 cities, and where actually the low gross enrollment ratio, then etc. to benefit the most disadvantaged area and socio-economically disadvantaged groups actually comes under the new phase of Rashtriya Uchchatar Shiksha Abhiyan. If you further talk about, then the implement the recommendations and the aims of the National Education Policy 2020 comes under the Rashtriya Uchchatar Shiksha Abhiyan. If you talk about the state government will be supported for the gender inclusion, equity initiatives and information and communication technology and enhancing employability through vocationalization and skill upgradation is comes under the new phase of Rashtriya Uchchatar Shiksha Abhiyan. Further, if you talk about state universities will be supported for the multidisciplinary education and research. Another, if you talk about grants means there will be a funding support will be provided to strengthening both the accredited university and non-accredited university comes under the new phase of Rashtriya Uchchatar Shiksha Abhiyan, which is recently approved by the government. Now we will talk about what are the objectives of the Rashtriya Uchchatar Shiksha Abhiyan. So if you talk about the objectives of the Rashtriya Uchchatar Shiksha Abhiyan, then remember that the first objective basically to improve the overall quality of state universities. Remember that by conforming to the prescribed norms and standards. So overall quality of state university is the one of the objective. If you talk about adoption of the accreditation, means the certificate of competency as a mandatory quality assurance framework. Remember that. Another is the promoting autonomy in state universities and improving the governance institution is another objective if you talk about. Another is the ensure the reforms in the affiliation, academic and examination system. Further, if you talk about ensure the adequate availability of quality faculty in all the higher educational institutions and ensure capacity building at all levels of employment. So remember that. If you talk about create an enabling atmosphere for research in the higher education system, which is very lacking in India, and also funding need to be provided in the budget as well for the research system. So remember that. If you talk about create the regional imbalance, remember that as you know in Kerala around there is 98% literacy, and if you talk about in Bihar around the 56% literacy, and that is what do you mean by the correct the regional imbalances. So remember that, and improve equity in higher education. These are the objectives of the Rashtriya Uchchatar Shiksha Abhiyan. So remember that. If you talk about the summary of this video, then remember that Rashtriya Uchchatar Shiksha Abhiyan is basically a centrally sponsored scheme. What do you mean by the centrally sponsored scheme? Means there is a share of funding between the center and the state. Remember that. If you talk about what is the main aim basically to provide the funding, strategic funding to the higher education institution. Remember that. So this is the basic aim, and this comes under the Ministry of Education, and from Ministry of Education to State Ministry of Education and State Education institution actually will be provided the funding procedure. So this is all about. Thank you guys. Hope you like this video. You should subscribe my channel. Thank you so much for watching this video.